can I say I'm delighted to be invited to give the 7th Kim Dae Jung Memorial Lecture. I think it's an enormous honor for anyone to have that privilege. I knew the president for nearly a quarter of a century. He was a survivor. Before I met him, before I knew him, there were at least 2 attempts to assassinate him. He was the leading figure in the South Korean opposition to the military dictatorial regime. There was an attempt to kill him in a car crash. Then he was kidnapped when he was in Tokyo and taken out to sea in a small boat and had concrete attached to his legs before the United States intervened with a helicopter to actually stop him from being thrown overboard. That didn't end his problems. He had a series of arrests and jail terms after that. And of course, he had a death sentence for being blamed for being leader of the opposition with the Gwangju massacre. For those who want to know about his early life, well, before I met him, there's a South Korean film with Byung-sung called The Kingmaker, about how he worked with, I guess, early political advisors to actually overcome the fact he kept losing elections till he got to the point of actually winning them for the first time. As I said, I mean, after the Gwangju massacre, he had a death sentence imposed on him and suffered harsh interrogations. Later, I was able to invite him to the European Parliament to make a solemn address to the European Parliament back almost over 20 years ago. And I remember one of my colleagues who was sat next to me actually said, "Doesn't he walk badly?" Well, the reason he walked badly was because he'd been tortured. So I walk badly as well. That's just my bad luck. In his case, it was part of his political sacrifice. When he was released under pressure from the United States from prison where the death sentence had been commuted, he went in exile to the United States and there continued his campaign of opposition to the military authoritarian regime. But he decided that the best way to put pressure on the regime was to return to Korea. And he got on a plane, accompanied by a number of congressmen and other people, and flew into Korea on the 8th of February, 1985. Some of the people concerned were roughed up who came in with him, and he was spirited away to his house where he was held under house arrest with still a 20-year jail sentence over him. What he did was actually the same as Benigno Ninoy Aquino did in the Philippines. He had returned from opposition to the Suharto regime back a couple of years earlier. And when he'd returned and he walked down the steps of the plane in Manila, he'd been assassinated by a sniper. There was a lot of concern that the same kind of accident, the same kind of event might happen to Kim Dae Jung. So I was in Tokyo, as you were told. I was a visiting professor at Todai. Let me say I was teaching in English, not Japanese. I can just about order a beer or find my way to a railway station. But friends of mine in South Korean exiles in Japan urged me to go and meet with to be President Kim in Seoul, to make sure, saying that if we kept as much interest in what was happening to him as possible, then it was less likely that he would meet with an accident. So I flew over I went for the first time in 1985 and met with Kim Dae Jung at his house. I had to make my way through several hundred riot police who were surrounding the house, but obviously being a Westerner rather than someone local, they decided they would let me in, and we met together. I met him on a second occasion, not long after, where he was still under house arrest. On both of those occasions, I actually told the British Embassy that I was going, but there wasn't very much interest. And then, after democracy was opened up to a degree in South Korea, I went back. President Kim had been elected to the National Assembly in 1986, December. And so I went. And this time I told the British Embassy that I was going. And now I had the ambassadorial car outside my hotel to pick me up and take me to meet with this eminent man. The ambassador told me how lucky I was to be able to meet with such an important person. I agreed with him, but the ambassador was slightly surprised when Kim greeted me by name and embraced me rather than treating me as if some visiting politician. Around this time, I was in the European Parliament by now, and I coordinated with Kim and Kim's office resolutions criticizing the failure to investigate what was behind the Gwangju massacre, to condemn the visit by Chun Doo-hwan to the United Kingdom and Europe. So we orchestrated this together over a period of time. Then, of course, in December 1992, there was a presidential election. It was beginning to open up. South Korea was not fully open. It was not fully democratic, but at least there was some space for the opposition groups. And unfortunately, well, it was the reality. Two opposition figures, Kim Young-sam and Kim Dae Jung, both stood, and Kim Young-sam actually won. And at that point, for a brief period of time, President Kim thought his political career was over. He actually withdrew from politics in South Korea and went to Cambridge University to do a fellowship. And I had the opportunity at that time to invite him during his fellowship to come over to Brussels, where I introduced him to people in the European Parliament and the rest. He came back into politics later that year, and I was invited as, I think, the only European member to actually be part of the Forum of Democratic Leaders in the Asia Pacific, where it was President Kim, Corazon Aquino, Sonia Gandhi, and Oscar Arias who were the founding members. And then, of course, finally, the breakthrough, when in the 18th of December 1997, Kim was elected at his fourth attempt as president of South Korea. And subsequently, I was invited to the Blue House by him to celebrate his election victory. And as I said, I helped to organize him to be the first Asian leader to give a solemn address to the European Parliament. There he talked in his address about building a cyber Silk Road linking Asia to Europe, about an iron Silk Road linking the Trans-Korean Railway from Busan to London. Talked about North and South Korean relationships and obviously his Sunshine Policy. And the crux of the Sunshine Policy calls for the peaceful coexistence and peaceful exchange and cooperation between the two Koreas. The European Union took part in the CADO project. I presume it was one of the first deals in the mid-90s between the United States and North Korea, that they would freeze their nuclear program in exchange, basically, for the building of 2 light water reactors. And That was a $4.5 billion operation. South Korea agreed to put in 2/3, Japan $1 billion, and somebody needed to bridge the gap, albeit a comparatively small one. And the European Union was part of that process because the Prime Minister of Japan at the time, Moriyama, said, I can't do this without somebody other than the South Koreans being involved in this process. And of course, President Kim was responsible for the European Union establishing diplomatic relations with North Korea. I remained in touch with him up to his death on the 18th of August 2009. The last time I met him was in the February of that year, and I was subsequently able to meet Lee Hee-ho, his wife. So that's my connection. I played a very, very minor part, but I'm proud of that part I played in actually promoting the ideas of President Kim. As you've been told, I was an MEP. It was very politely put that I decided to set up a consultancy and an NGO in 2009. I actually lost the election. That's why I did that. I was voted out. So yeah, it was Hobson's choice, as we say in the United Kingdom. But I was invited by the North Koreans to actually go to Pyongyang in 1997. That was my first visit. It was during the time of what people call the arduous march, when there was starvation on a large scale in North Korea. And they came to see me, and in 1997 there was no diplomatic relations with the European Union. And they came to see me and asked me if I could get them some food aid. And I said, I need to see what the situation is on the ground. So myself and two colleagues, actually two Labour Party colleagues, went to Pyongyang, and we saw how grim it was. And some of those pictures are picturing the DPRK in the orphanages and the children's centres of hungry and starving children. I asked them at the end of this process, would you like an official delegation? And they said, oh, yes. You don't care how I get it? No. So I came back, and the three of us actually tabled a rather critical resolution demanding access to Pyongyang by an official delegation to see for ourselves what the situation was. And to everybody's surprise, apart from mine, the response to this rather brutal resolution was the North Koreans said, please send a delegation. So I was going back. I was part of that delegation. And then they sent a delegation to the EU. Then we had two further delegations to Pyongyang. And then in 2004, the European Parliament decided to set up a standing delegation with the Korean Peninsula. And I was a member of that delegation. And that delegation continues today. And hopefully it will continue in the next European Parliament, where I hope you're all going to be voting on the 9th. I don't care who you vote for, you just vote for somebody. Well, I do actually, but I won't go into that. As I chaired a committee of inquiry into the growth of racism and fascism in Europe, you can probably guess who not to vote for. I'm now going to talk about where we are with, if you want, North Korea, what the situation is, because there's a lot of myths going around. Kim Il-sung, in the early 1990s, actually saw the collapse of the Soviet Empire, because Kim had been very clever in playing between 1953 at the end of the Korean War and the late 80s, early 90s. Kim had very successfully played off Moscow against Beijing. If you're a philatelist, it's fascinating to look at North Korean stamp history, because at times it's all Chinese heroes and then it's all Soviet heroes. It switches backwards and forwards over the years. But he'd very successfully played them off. But with the collapse of the Soviet Empire, Moscow had no interest in North Korea. It was the middle of nowhere. And of course, the Chinese no longer had the pressure to be nicer than Moscow. So they started demanding payment in hard currency. So Kim decided he had two unilateral objectives to fulfill. First was a unilateral security capacity, which included nuclear. So that's in a sense when the serious start of the nuclear program started, at least in his head, if not on the ground. And secondly, to normalize relations with the global hegemon, the United States. No longer were they getting the grants, the loans, and the counter-trading from Moscow and Beijing. They had to stand on their own 2 feet. Those twin policies were followed by Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un. But increasingly, over time, the only option was the nuclear one. The North Korean economy was stuttering at best, and the South Korean economy was soaring. It was South Korea that actually had the resources and had the money. I now believe that 30-year chapter of trying to engage with the United States has closed. It's closed for a series of reasons, and I'll come back into more detail later on. But one of the reasons for its closing was the fiasco in Hanoi, when Kim Jong-un met with Donald Trump. He was expecting to do a deal. For whatever reason, Trump walked away. There were domestic reasons at the time that were distracting Trump and the rest. But he walked away. That was an enormous loss of face by Kim Jong-un. Second, third, and fourth is Afghanistan, Ukraine, and Gaza. Afghanistan saw, from Pyongyang's perspective, a retreat by the United States from a long-running war. Ukraine saw the United States dithering over what to do about the Russian invasion. And of course, Gaza has again demonstrated Washington's inability to control one of its allies. So on that basis, Pyongyang has a view that if you want global hegemony by the United States is now over. There is now a new emerging bloc. It's a second Cold War. It's a bloc policy. We don't need to normalize relations with the United States. We can cuddle up to Beijing and to Moscow. The North is often accused of being irrational, isolated, and unwilling to talk. Well, in their own terms, it seems to me that they're very rational. And isolation, I think, is a comparative term. They're very isolated from the West, but not the rest. They've had long-term relationships with many countries in Africa, Latin America, and in Asia. We're also told that they're unwilling to talk. It depends to who. They're certainly unwilling to talk to South Korea. They're unwilling to talk to the United States. And more recently, they're unwilling to talk to Japan. There was an attempt at some kind of reconciliation a few months ago between Prime Minister Kishida and Pyongyang. But that fell apart fundamentally over the abductee issue. But what's fascinating is it's not true that they're unwilling to talk elsewhere. Obviously, I'm still involved. I'm still working in Brussels. And I've been approached by the North Koreans on 4 occasions in the last 3 years to try and get engagement with the EU. And it's the EU that has said no, not the North Koreans. There was an attempt. I've been engaged in a political dialogue with North Korea since 2010, a formal dialogue between myself, Jonathan Powell, who was Tony Blair's chef de cabinet, a few other senior ex-ministers and the rest from across Europe, Sweden, Germany, Switzerland, France. And that political dialogue meant that we know some of the key people. We persuaded them to actually offer to reopen the human rights dialogue with the EU. When the EU was offered at opening of the human rights dialogue, the response from the European Union was no. It will make North Korea look too good. And since then, there have been at least 3 other attempts to open a dialogue. We have the Belgians and the French are blocking a North Korean embassy in Brussels. So the North Korean embassy to the European Union is in Berlin. Since 2016, when with Brexit it moved from London to Berlin, the North Korean embassy in Berlin has never been able to visit Brussels. So you have an embassy that's not an embassy. There really isn't, if you want, a relationship. So where are we? How do we get there, and where are we going? Oh, on that last point, I have to say, there was a satellite launch, a failed satellite launch by North Korea about 3 days ago. The European Union put out a statement saying you should not be launching satellites, you should be talking to people. And I thought, hang on, you're the people who are refusing to talk to them. But hey, that's where we are. Pyongyang's nuclear program is a sign of weakness, not strength. It's very important. Seoul outspends Pyongyang by a factor of 11 year on year in terms of its military budget. So the North is going nuclear because conventionally it can't compete. With Tokyo and Washington, North Korea is outspent by a factor of 250. More graphically, in a way, in 2021, the South Koreans increased their military budget by 10.3% in 2021. That was the equivalent of North Korea's total military budget. So that's where we are. I mean, the Republic of Korea has been an enormous success. And rising tides float all ships. Not only have they been successful in terms of their civilian technology, there's been an enormous success in terms of military technology. At the beginning, the South Koreans did some pretty basic work, but they're now building sophisticated weapons, American by design, because of course that they have to be American by design, because otherwise it doesn't work in terms of the alliance. These tanks, the other military technology, are ideal as replacements in Europe for what's been sent to the Ukraine. So, and they're cheaper than buying American. President Yoon has the ambition that South Korea should be the world's #4 arms exporter by 2030. And it looks as if that will happen. But that helps give you some idea of the comparative disadvantage of Pyongyang. I mean, there's been a dramatic change. 25 years ago, the ratio of South Korean spending to North Korean spending was 3-1. Now, as I said, it's 11-1 and actually rising. Kim Jong-un and his father, but Kim Jong-un principally, faces a twofold challenge: internal and external. Now, there will be no Magnolia Revolution in North Korea, but it is important for the leadership, Kim Jong-un and the court around him, to actually keep people who matter happy. If you matter in North Korea, you live in Pyongyang. I mean, if you go to Pyongyang, around Pyongyang are border controls. You cannot enter Pyongyang without a permit. So, and if you're a young male official of the international department of the party, you can become very attractive, because if you marry someone like that, you get to move to Pyongyang, and that's much better than living elsewhere. It's conceivable, I mean, if there is any problem, it's going to be a court squabble amongst the people who matter. So, in Pyongyang, you get everything. There's lots of spending. You've got roads, SUVs, restaurants, entertainment, a dolphinarium, a whole set of fun fairs. I once met with one of the ministers who said, this year's program is coal, cement, iron, and fun fairs. They delivered on the fun fairs. They're really quite good, mainly Italian. So, but yes, they've got that all there. So that's important. Security is about trying to stop regime change from outside. If you're stopping it from inside by, if you want looking after the people who matter, you stop it on the outside by deterrence. North Korea is only too well aware of the situation. Kim Jong-un was there the month before he took over when his father died. You could watch, excuse the language, you could watch Gaddafi being buggered by a bayonet on live TV. And he'd been told to follow the Libyan model, but the attraction as a Libyan model rather disappeared. He saw that the problem was not having weapons of mass destruction, but not having weapons of mass destruction. You need to have them. If you're supplying bread and circuses, you need growth. I mean, as I said, you got the fun fairs, bread and fun fairs. For the bread, you need growth. You need to imagine North Korea. Some people imagine it as a developing state. North Korea is absolutely not a developing state. It's a failed industrial state. After the Korean War, North Korea took off, helped by the Soviet Empire, the Soviet bloc, but it actually was rather successful in the Stalinist mode of industrialization with cement, iron, coal, and the rest. What it was unable to do was to make the transition from heavy industry to light industry. It's always been the problem of Stalinist modeled economy. Yeah, you can do the heavy industry very well, but you can't do the light industry. Alongside the heavy industry, there was an industrialization of agriculture. It's not an agricultural economy. It's agriculture in terms of manpower and women power is actually fairly small. And this was the reason for the famine in the arduous march after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, fundamentally, because the agricultural economy was actually industrialized. Agriculture had been electrified. It had been mechanized. Irrigation required pumping and fertilizer. With the end of cheap oil from the former Soviet Union, agriculture collapsed. The agricultural productivity in those years collapsed by a factor of something close to 50%. It didn't help that there were floods and droughts around the same time. A combination of the two led to the arduous march when probably at least 1 million people died. They didn't die in the classic style of Ethiopia or the Sahel or whatever. People got less than they needed to survive on long term. And so people died of opportunistic illnesses because they were weak. They died because they starved, because grandparents passed on their food ration to the grandchildren. So you had this starvation in slow motion. There is an interest, has been for a while, in market reform. Again, we're told that the North Koreans aren't interested in reform. They're not interested in American-style reform of the market. What they're interested in is Asian-style capitalism. They're interested in the state-owned enterprises. They're interested in the zaibatsu. They're interested in the chaebol. I mean, at one time, I was talking about 2 countries, 1 system. They like to model themselves on South Korea in terms of a very different form of capitalism from the one that you see in the United States and Europe. Air Koryo, my favorite airline, where I'm probably a platinum card holder if they had a if they had a mileage program, is now into taxis and foodstuffs. So you're seeing you're seeing integration in the economy. What they don't like around Pyongyang and across the country, probably since the arduous march, you've actually had markets with people buying and selling things. Some of them are fairly prominent. I mean, when I go to Pyongyang, I can go to what used to be called the Tongil market. Tongil's reunification, so it won't be called that anymore, but I don't know what the new name is. And some are rather grayer areas. If you become a market trader, it tends to be women, because women can get out of the compulsory employment rather easier than men. So if you're a woman and set up a trading operation, if you survive, that's absolutely fine. The problem is you thrive. If you start making serious money, and out of the thousands of people who've gone into it, a few have, then that's much more of a problem. Because there was a period where you could see in Pyongyang signs of conspicuous consumption. People drinking, Koreans drinking bottles of champagne, not wearing their badges, and the rest. Those are the people who've been stamped down on. They are what I call the Ronin capitalists, the masterless samurai of the markets have been stamped down on, because they're the people who are not under control. Instead, in terms of reform, what they like is what you might refer to as public-private partnerships. The International Department of the Party has a series of units. At one time, the European unit was running a nice Italian pizzeria. And the same is true not only for the party, but for the military and the ministries. And so you've got, you work together, and the institutions get some share of what's going on alongside the individuals making profits. There's also an attempt to reform in the factories. They had what they used to, back probably in the 60s, the 70s, they had what they called the Taean work system, which was an efficient way of maximizing production. They've come back to that. There's been some talk about more freedom of production. Apart from in the military sector, companies can make whatever they can sell. So you can innovate. You've got enterprise party units. Within the enterprise, the party units, because all the important people, in fact, almost everybody's a member of the party, but some people, but you have a party leadership alongside the traditional management. And you have, to a degree, workers' control, where senior workers are consulted, kind of a leftist notion of workers' control, or like we had in Britain when the Lucas Aerospace company in the United Kingdom closed, the unions got together and produced an alternative corporate plan. What can we use our skills for to make something else? So it's not getting very far, but there are attempts being made to remodel things in that kind of way. North Korea has two key choke points: energy and manpower. That's what stops the economy from being successful. The nuclear option actually answers both of those questions, because civil nuclear power is the way forward for them. They've exhausted the potential from coal. Hydroelectricity is at its limits. They would have the option of some serious tidal power, but fine. The easy answer are light water reactors, which is why they rather like the Singapore Declaration, which talked about denuclearizing the peninsula, because that means we can have civil nuclear power, because the South Koreans aren't going to give up all their civil nuclear power stations, and hated President Biden's reformulation of denuclearizing the North, For them, that meant Biden was cutting off the option of civil nuclear power. That's why in Hanoi, the North Koreans wanted to keep their second enrichment plant, because they want control. And with light water, if you've got uranium, which they have, and you've got an enrichment plant like the Iranians had, which enriches up to 20%, not up to weapons grade material, you can then fuel your light water reactors. Equally, you can solve the manpower problem, because the nuclear deterrent means that you could decant 100,000 men out of the army just by cutting conscription by a year. There's about 1.4 million men, almost entirely men, in the army on a 10-year conscription. So if you cut it by a year to 9, you get 140,000 instantly. Now, it's a very old model of industrial society. The North Koreans see a successful economy as actually being, if you want, big factories with thousands of workers. Now, that's not what we see these days in Europe. But it just might work for North Korea. It just might work, because they're the world's last pool of cheap, skilled labor. Cheap, unskilled labor is everywhere. Cheap, skilled labor might just work. So if you go up to the special economic zone in Rasong, which is up on the China-Russia border, there is a direct border with Russia, you will see in the clothing plants, in operations, you will see NBA basketball shirts being made with made in China labels, because they're cheaper than China. China's subcontracting across. In terms of the military program, where are we? They have a functioning atomic bomb, absolutely. There's no solid evidence that they've been able to miniaturize their bomb, because that's important if you want multiple independent re-entry vehicles on the top of your missile. And the last nuclear test could have been a hydrogen bomb, which is obviously that much stronger. And when Kim, in his New Year's address this year, talked about a new superweapon, one's assuming that if there is another nuclear test, it will be a test of a hydrogen bomb. In terms of missiles, I mean, they've got short-range ballistic missiles that work, medium-range, intermediate-range ballistic missiles that work. What they don't have, the ICBMs are unreliable. They could crash an ICBM on the mainland United States probably with no difficulty. The problem is it doesn't have the payload capacity for multiple warheads. So it means if you want, missile defense actually works at a small number of incoming vehicles. They don't have the guidance technology. So I've been told recently in the State Department, if they aim for Washington, they'd probably hit Baltimore. God help Baltimore, it's got enough problems. And they don't have re-entry capacity. If you're doing a long-range intercontinental missile, you go outside the atmosphere and come back in again. And that's when things get very hot. And there's no evidence they've got much re-entry capacity. The problem is they barely know themselves, because, of course, unlike the United States, they don't have a sophisticated global monitoring. And so when they fire an ICBM, they don't know what state it comes down when it lands at the other end. So they have a problem there. One of the most useful things we could probably do for them is to give them some satellites, so they actually know what's going on rather than having to guess. But that's a different issue. Now, in itself, this poses a threat about extended deterrence by the United States. I mean, in Europe, people thought that the US probably would sacrifice itself to save Paris or Berlin. People are more doubtful about whether they're going to save Seoul or Tokyo in the same way. I see time is passing, so I'm going to be a bit briefer. Provocations first and provoking. I mean, Pyongyang is certainly capable of provocations, but they're really short of resources. I mean, Kim Jong-un can't get out of bed in the morning without somebody saying it's a provocation. The reality is that there are good technical reasons for testing. They need to test their weapons development. Now, they might pick July the 4th rather than July the 6th or whatever. But most of what the North Koreans are doing are done for good technical reasons. It's certainly in terms of their advanced military technologies. Some of the more established ones, fine. You could let off a short-range missile. It's not a problem. But when you've got very little opportunity to test, you need to test. How are we going to resolve, how can we resolve the problems that face us? Well, the best deal ever was, in my view, was the 1993 agreed framework, when I mentioned it earlier, the North Koreans agreed a moratorium on nuclear developments in exchange for 2 light water reactors built with South Korean and Japanese and a little bit of EU money, in exchange for what turned out to be a 10-year freeze, which was great news for the Americans because it was only 4.5 billion, and anyway, it was somebody else's money. It was the South Koreans, it was the Japanese and the Europeans who were paying for it. I mean, all the United States had to pay for was some heavy fuel oil in the interim. And they couldn't even do that after Clinton lost the midterms. There was no heavy fuel oil. And I was the rapporteur in the European Parliament for CADO. And I got very few phone calls from Tony Blair. I think I probably got about 1 in my life. And I got a phone call from Blair saying, Clinton can't get the money for the heavy fuel oil. You're the rapporteur, can you get some more money? Which we did. And we were in favor at the time of doing this. So it was completely illegal because we used money that was in the atomic energy budget to buy oil to ship to North Korea. But okay, it worked. The problem was that the agreed framework was killed by Bush the Younger, when in 2002 he actually abandoned the whole thing. The next attempt was 6-party talks, which the North Koreans believed were sabotaged by Moscow. The 6-party talks were China, Russia, North Korea, South Korea, America, Japan. And the Japanese, understandably, there's an enormous public resentment about North Korea abducting a number of Japanese citizens in the 70s from Japan and elsewhere. And there's been a demand by the Japanese that these people need to be returned. And when Koizumi visited, a small group of them were, but they're demanding that they all be returned. The Japanese position is they're all alive and will have to be returned. Well, one of them, I think, is now 95, with a life expectancy in North Korea of 67. I'm not sure he's going to be coming back, but Japan still insists. But then there was the Leap Day Agreement, which everyone gets excited about, which was more an April Fool's joke than anything else, because it was announced that North Korea was prepared to give up everything for something less than 10% of what it got with the agreed framework. Now, the North Koreans could conceivably be bad negotiators, but no one's that bad. And the last opportunity, of course, was Trump. Back in 2017, you had a nuclear test in sort of, I think it was October, and you had 2 ICBM launches in November. I was actually there after the nuclear test and before the ICBM launches with this political dialogue. And Ri So-young was head of the international department of the party at the time, said the Americans are not going to like what we do next. And that was perfectly true. The Americans did not like what they did next. And then early in 2018, there was a threat, who's got the bigger button? My button's bigger than yours, I mean, Trump was saying. I'm not sure it's the button that counts, but nevertheless. And the North was preparing a preemptive strike. I mean, they'd seen what happened in the Gulf. They weren't going to sit there and wait for the Americans to deploy everything. At the point when they thought it was inevitable, they were going to strike. And one of the testing points was going to be the evacuation of non-combatants by the Americans from South Korea. And Ri So-young, as I said, told us this, and we were in the White House a couple of weeks later, and we told McMaster, who was then National Security Advisor, this. And apparently, I didn't know it, none of us knew at the time, it's in Bob Woodward's book that came out a year later. This report of what Ri So-young said was rushed to Trump, and he's cancelled the decision to evacuate non-combatants. So, yeah, that was the good news. At the 2018 New Year's address, Americans make State of the Unions and North Koreans make New Year's addresses. Actually, it talked about Pyongyang North Korea coming to the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. And that's what led to the Singapore summit. The missing link was the 2019 New Year's address. You had the Singapore summit, then the North Korean State of the Union, end of the year, beginning of the next year, talked about Kim was signaling he was ready and willing to engage. It was there for anyone who's got eyes to see. A transformation. He talked about mass production. In 2018, he was talking about mass production of nuclear weapons. In 2019, he was talking about arms conversion, about how they, in the arms sector, had been producing farm machinery and construction equipment. He promised to abandon sales, Syria, and first use of nuclear weapons, and to neither make, test, or proliferate. It was all there. I don't know how many of you know one of my favorite films, The Life of Brian. In The Life of Brian, you have, what did the Romans ever do for us? And you have a list of, well, maybe aqueducts, sanitation, roads, wine, canals, baths, education. Well, I mean, I think you could say to the North Koreans, what did the North Koreans ever offer us? Defense conversion, non-proliferation, and no first use. Maybe not. So then you had the car crash of Hanoi, and the two sides talked past each other. The thinking was incommensurable. They didn't know. With North Korea, you only get what's on the box. There's no 2-for-1 offer. There's no happy hour. But the Americans constantly wanted to get more than they'd negotiated. For the US and for Trump, this was a one-stop shop. We're going to have a meeting and they're going to denuclearize and that's it. Tick, box, done. Instant gratification was never going to happen. What you needed is a program. Kim was looking for a decade-long process with the start of a new relationship. They needed to build trust. After all, they'd seen what had happened in Iraq and elsewhere. Kim was not asking for all sanctions to be lifted. Frankly, they're not interested in the lifting of US sanctions because they know it's not going to happen. Like they're not interested in a peace treaty with the United States. There's no way Congress is going to lift sanctions on North Korea. It took them nearly 30 years to lift sanctions on the Soviet Union against their treatment of the Jews until about 2010. So there's no way sanctions are going to be lifted. And there's no way there's going to be a peace treaty. What they want was a mitigation of UN sanctions, which is clearly something rather different and can be done rather more easily. And of course, the North Koreans have a clear idea from their own experience of the value of a piece of paper. Clinton signed the piece of paper, a green framework. Here we are. Bush ripped it up. So they're actually looking for something much more. The agreed framework was killed by Bush. What they're interested in is the JCPOA model, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was a deal done by the UN Security Council plus the EU and Germany with Iran over it was the Iran deal, where they gave up their pretensions on nuclear development in exchange for keeping an enriched uranium facility to produce uranium up to 20% that can be used for fueling nuclear power stations, but can't be used for weapons development. And what interested the North Koreans in the JPCOA is when Trump came to office, he said, JPCOA, don't agree with it, over, finished. And what was interesting is everybody else, you would expect China and Russia to say that, but so did the EU, so did Germany, so did France, so did the United Kingdom. The Iranians are sticking to this deal. So it gave a resilience and robustness that was never true with the agreed framework. And of course, so what we're looking for are security guarantees, in this case, probably from the UN Security Council, plus in this case, the Republic of Korea, Japan, and the European Union. Why is the European Union in there? Because we're payers, if not players. Somebody's got to put together an aid package, because the North Koreans, if they aren't going to get 2 light water reactors worth 4.5 billion, what are they going to get? Well, in today's terms, and certainly allowing for the inflation of what's been given to Ukraine, they're probably looking for something like $25 billion or even 25 billion euros as reparations for the consequence of sanctions or industrial aid, however you want to put it, in terms of humanitarian aid and the rest. Of course, the result of Hanoi was that the pro-engagement elements in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Pyongyang and the International Department of the Party, well, probably not, but they got retired. Ri So-young, our interlocutor, was actually in the room with Trump. He retired. Ri Yong-ho apparently is on gardening leave, but that means he's working in a farm in the middle of nowhere. Choi Sung-hui, she was sent off to the party school for re-education and is back, but she's certainly not talking engagement very much at all. International Department was replaced initially by a Russian specialist, and he didn't last very long, and there's now a Chinese specialist, Kim Song-nam, there. And we've had indications of a possible visit sometime in the near future back to Pyongyang, but they can't give us a date yet, so it may be a while. The problem was, as I started off in a sense, the US is neither willing nor able. The North Koreans saw this as the sabotage of the subalterns, people like Bolton and Pompeo. They see Trump as being a puppet on a string. The American deep state will stop someone as eccentric as Trump from actually delivering in Hanoi. And as I said before, this coincided with the retreat from Afghanistan, the dithering and buck passing over Ukraine, and the impotence over Gaza, to them for North Korea to decide we need a total reset. Normalizing relations with Washington was impossible, but now unnecessary. The wish was the father to the thought, but Pyongyang sees itself as no longer being alone. The result was the 2024 New Year's address. No unification with South Korea, the main enemy, and they're going to reset their maritime boundaries probably sometime this autumn. Ri So-young, when we were dealing with him, I mean, the position on reunification is not very, very new in terms of, if you want, the senior figures in North Korea. The people at the top are very well aware of what the situation is. They know South Korea's got an economy that's 50 times stronger. That's nothing new. So early reunification can only be assimilation. And of course, assimilation is not very attractive. So there was no early reunification. The argument was, get off our backs, and we will be able to grow our economy like the other Asian tigers, like South Korea, at 10, 15% a year. Now, after a decade, 2 decades, maybe a quarter of a century, then we're in the same league as South Korea, then we can talk. So in a sense, the opposition to unification was private made public. The ROK as the enemy is slightly different. Firstly, one of the drivers was follow the money. The North Koreans saw the South Koreans as providing financial aid in terms of the Kaesong industrial complex and some of the other promises, and that never really happened. So there was no money. And secondly, you have the problem of Pyongyang's order of battle. If nuclear weapons are going to be used early, the ladder of escalation in North Korea maybe only has one rung, at most about two. But if that's the case, you have a situation where the South Koreans, as misguided, misled, oppressed people, doesn't really work anymore because you're not capable of targeting to avoid them. If you actually look, there's a book published back in 1951 by John Riley and Wilbur Schramm, The Reds Take a City, which was an analysis of what happened in Seoul after the North Koreans captured Seoul. And yes, of course, there were lots of mistakes, and it was fairly brutal. But they separated out the targets from the non-targets. Yeah, they separated out the leadership of the South from ordinary South Koreans. You can't do that with nuclear weapons. That separation and winnowing is no longer possible. On terms of the border, the South Koreans invented the Northern Limit Line, which is supposedly the maritime border between North and South. Even Washington was slightly skeptical of the Northern Limit Line, but fine. With unification kind of there as a promise, it wasn't really overshadowing relations. But now with this view that North and South are separate countries, then there's a different argument. If you look at the law, the International Law of the Sea Convention, about where international law would draw that boundary, it would draw it considerably to the south of where the South Koreans have drawn the boundary. There'll be hundreds, if not thousands, of square kilometers of maritime resources that should be in the north rather than the south. And you've already seen Kim talking about this recently in the last few days, about how the South are invading, are impinging on North Korean territory. What's to be done? Where to go from here? Well, we first need to address the elephant in the polling station, Donald Trump. I mean, firstly, he's likely to tip the South into going nuclear. For him, the miracle on the Han River, where the South Korean economy boomed, was only possible under the US nuclear umbrella. They got it cheap. It was subsidized. He wants full repayment for the cost of US troops and compensation for the benefits that came from the US nuclear umbrella. The special measures agreement, where the South Koreans are being asked to pay maybe 5 times more than they're paying at the moment, is going to be unacceptable to the South, certainly in the medium term. So the option is to do it yourself. And many people say, certainly amongst the elite, there's already a majority in favor of going nuclear. And amongst much of the population, there's support for South Korea's own nuclear weapons. The problem is with this, that it will almost instantly be followed by Japan and possibly Taiwan. And we can see that's going to create some interesting problems. Also, you have the temporal gap. It's the opposite of a window of opportunity. It's a window of death. Because between announcing you're going nuclear and actually having a usable nuclear weapon, even with South Korea's advanced technology, there's a gap of some years. And obviously in that gap, because the Americans will have taken their ball home, then there's an opportunity for North Korea to engage in military adventurism and the rest. The South may be a fast technical economy, but it's not that fast. In a sense, a Biden victory might be better for the South, because the Republicans, Trump is a figurehead of a bigger change, and his eccentricities rather hide the fact he's got the support of Republicans behind him. So for the South, it might be better to use a Biden second-term victory as the opportunity to do this while under the umbrella. If Trump returns, the North might talk. I mean, people are saying, well, the problem is Biden's not interested in talking on any terms of interest of North Koreans, even before they've reset. But once bitten, twice shy. I don't see those talks going anywhere. Kim Jong-un is not going to risk the humiliation of Hanoi again. China's concern offer hope because China is deeply concerned about the South going nuclear, let alone Japan and Taiwan. So with some delicacy and difficulty, a multilateral approach with China there might offer some negotiation over arms control. I mean, the door of denuclearization is firmly closed, but they might save Washington's face by agreeing an untabled, after you've got arms control, in 10 years' time, we will start denuclearization. We're back with the agreed framework. Actually, even if you don't go all the way, that would be a win. As I said before, with Washington has to learn you only get what's on the box. To conclude, Kim Dae Jung would have decried the lost opportunities of the last 15 years. But he knew well, like Robert Bruce's spider, to try again. It will be a new path and a fresh challenge. And it will need to be done together. As I talked, if security guarantees are not going to be a piece of paper by one US president to another. In a sense, we need to return to the start. President Kim, in ending his solemn address to the European Parliament, said, you need to rewrite Kipling. Kipling said, east is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet. But in today's global world, we have to strive and thrive together. As President Kim said, the new version is east is west and west is east, and never the twain shall part. We need to work together to solve one of the world's most dangerous problems. Thank you.